Before we start this podcast, I want to definitely remind you of a sponsor for Fresh of the Word, 20 by 20 Apparel. Founded in 2015, 20 by 20 Apparel brings original tributes to pro wrestling's classic arenas, moments, and events. They look to spotlight the bloopers, bleeps, and body slams along with the biggest, smallest, strangest, and strongest. In the world of wrestling where there's hundreds of shirts, promotions, flyers, social media accounts, and ads, don't get lost in the sea of parody shirts and display fonts. They can provide professional graphic design services at a reasonable price. 20 by 20 also hand screen prints all the tees in-house. So if you'd like to discuss a possible run of tees, posters, koozies, foam fingers, or even Zubaz, then drop them a line at 20by20apparel.com. That's the number 20x, the number 20apparel.com. And also check out their enamel pin line. It's super cool.
Fresh is the word.
I'm Jim Duggan, got long wood for plenty hoes. I keep it fresher than fresh, but you already know. You suckers bummy, I'm money, I got a ton of flows. My weed loud like a motherfucking thunder roll. Your shit quiet like you ballin' on a budget though. We see your kicks and we laugh and yellin' what it goes. You see me shining like a suit on puffy. You know my grindin' shit is too strong, buddy. That's why the dude call money. I be stuntin' like it's nothing at all. Cause it's nothing to me, it's probably something to y'all. Trying to smoke like me, then come and fuck with your dog. Got a closet full of kicks, you can't cop it tomorrow. And I'm fresher than the freshest, you can tell it's in my essence. Bitch, you see the way I'm rapping, yes I do this shit to death. I tell I'm running out of breath, I tell somebody cut a check. But either way you know it's fresh, and either way you know it's fresh. Fresh, we fresh. Fresh, 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 goddammit, we fresh. Fresh, fresh, goddammit, we so damn fresh.
Welcome to the Fresh is the Word podcast. I'm your host, Kelly K. Fresh Frazier, and this is episode 183. And our guest for this episode is Troy Jeffrey Allen, who is a comic book writer and a member of the consumer marketing department for Diamond Comics Distributors. They're the biggest distributor of comics in the world. You might have seen him in the Previews World weekly videos on YouTube, along with being a contributing writer for a variety of online publications, a co-creator at Rexo Comics, and he's also in charge of marketing for the Urban Action Showcase. Troy Jeffrey Allen shares with us the best avenues for reaching comic buyers and about the importance of pre-ordering comics through comic shops. We also talk about how the comics business works in regards to how comics are distributed, the parallels between comic books and the vinyl industry and music, reaching out to different types of casual audiences, along with comic books history in regards to minority representation. All right, let's get on to the interview with Troy Jeffrey Allen. Go ahead and introduce yourself and just kind of give us a breakdown of what you do over at Diamond.
Hey, what's up, guys? This is Troy Jeffrey Allen with PreviousWorld.com, aka a subdivision of Diamond Comics Distributors. My job is consumer marketing, and my role is basically to make sure that the people get comics in their hands, and the people know exactly what type of comics that they are out there, and try to help them find the right comic for themselves, and just in general spread the gospel of comic books. And on top of that, I self-publish comics because everyone in comics has a side hustle. So
of course,
of course.
See, I'm mostly my background has always been music. I was a music journalist.
Okay, cool.
Came from the hip hop scene here in Detroit. So I kind of always think about things from the music industry sort of point of view. So when the past every once in a while I'd buy some comics here and there over the years, but it's been the past maybe year and a half that I've been doing the hardcore buying of stuff, going to conventions, stuff like that, and for a while there I was just this kind of works. This is kind of weird to me the way some of the stuff works because I'm used to music industry stuff. But I found after a while I kind of understood it. One of the main things how I learned about what comic book stores do and how they deal with comics and ordering comics and what Diamond does. A lot of that I learned through the podcast Super Skull that the Vault
Oh,
of
okay.
Midnight guys do.
Yeah. Actually, I've been to the store before. I've done signings there.
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
I learned a lot about what how things are distributed through there, and I was like, for a while, I was like, yeah, man, why do dude, why are they always like harping on pre-ordering these comics for like so long and stuff? And then I realized I'm like, oh, that's how they they get how many they want to actually purchase, and
Yeah.
that's like, and these things aren't in print for a long time, and there's like
Right.
all
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
things, man. I'm like, oh, okay, this is like totally like different than like music industry crap, like music industry, like boom, man, like you're printing off like thousands and tens of thousands of CDs or something.
Right.
Like they're just there, comics.
No, it's funny. Well, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say it's funny that you that you mentioned the music industry, because like an ongoing talking point of mine within marketing is that like we need to kind of look at what the vinyl side of the music industry has done in recent years and try to capture that, because I think that the music industry had a tough go at it in the late 90s, early 2000s, and pretty much people had declared and after that people pretty much declared vinyl dead. But now, like, they have like Record Store Day, like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And like, there's this like resurgence of collecting that I think whatever that mentality is, whatever that thing is that the world of like vinyl has tapped into, comics probably could tap into as well. So it's really interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah, I think like what's you kind of touched on it, but what parallels do you see with what the vinyl is doing with what comic books, because I always feel like there's always new technologies that came out to sort of like consume a lot of things, but then after a while you kind of like, there's certain people that just kind of get sick of it, and there's certain subcultures of it all that they want something in their hands, or they want to like have a tangible item in their hands,
Right.
and stuff like that. So what parallels do you see between like vinyl and comics?
I think I think that like what vinyl has done is like they've kind of made they're appealing to collectors, right? But they're also kind of giving you a premium experience. I'll give you an example. Like I own one of A$AP Rock's vinyls. I think it was the last one he released.
Yeah.
But like the cool thing about this, the Impossible Kit. And so the cool thing about it is like when I opened it, this was kind of my aha moment. Like it came with a trading card and a digital download, and it had a die cut cover and like a fold out poster that had the lyrics on the inside of it, and like it's giving you this premium experience. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so it's rewarding you for being a collector. And I think that that's a parallel that comics did in the 90s. That I think that like now we could probably potentially optimize now if, of course you have to get all the publishers on board with this concept, which is hard,
Right.
Pretty difficult. But like, this just creating an experience, like I think that's what vinyl is actively doing, is like it's creating an experience. Like they have I don't remember the exact name of it. It's like Record Store Day.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have Free Comic Book Day,
Right.
know? And I think that like, there's probably a way to give people similar experiences, because I know when you go to Record Store Day, you're getting that premium experience. You're getting like, not only are you there to buy existing stuff, but you're probably getting like, samples and like EPs and all this other stuff that like really gives you like really rewards the collector, basically.
Right.
And I think that those parallels are pretty clear, and like I think that like comics could do more of that. Actually, I will say this though, DC is trying to do something like that right now. They're doing that with the DC Black Label, and like I actually have come to really appreciate the DC Black Label. I don't know if you're familiar with that or.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I haven't read any of the titles on it, but I'm definitely familiar with what they're doing.
Yeah, like I think like I would recommend Batman Damned.
Yeah.
Like I would definitely pick it up. They had that whole Batwang controversy like a couple of months back, but it's really unfortunate. The unfortunate thing about that is DC was trying to give readers a premium experience that was for collectors, and like really kind of just make this sort of like create a almost pinky out comic book experience for people that want to like have that. And it's really unfortunate that like the Batwang thing kind of overshadowed what was like this really cool like concept that they're continuing to do. But it's like it kind of sucks that like that that little goofy controversy
Right.
overtook like what the overall point of it was, you know?
Right.
So, but I'm glad they're still doing. I'm glad they haven't shied away from it, and I actually think it's kind of great that they, again, for the collectors, that they altered the digital version. But if you got that print version, then you kind of got the original version of that first issue of Batman Damned. So yeah, I think that there's something to that I think comics should be tapping more into.
And I think in regards to comics, comparison to music, I feel like a lot of people that are doing it on their own, maybe like the sort of Kickstarter culture, they're doing a lot more of the experience because you get a lot of these goodies if you hit the stretch goals and stuff. Where I've in the music Kickstarters that I see, like I'm like after like pledging to like comic book Kickstarters, I see these music ones and I'm like, I'm bored with it.
Right, yeah.
Because it's like, all right, you get the CD, a vinyl, maybe a T-shirt, and I'm like, all right, this is cool, but
right. I mean, it's all the stuff that you get from a live show.
Right. I'm just like, but the comic book Kickstarters are like super fun to like be a part of, and it would be cool if there, like you were saying, there was more of an experience with the bigger publishers.
Yeah. And like I got to give credit where credit's due. DC is actively trying to do that with the BC Black Label, and like I hope it continues on. I think it's cool that they're going to fold in some of the older stuff, like the Vertigo titles and like the All-Star titles, and make it part of that label as well. And like, I can't recommend it enough. Like, I actually read Batman Damned 1 through 3 on the plane, and I was like, I come from a generation of people that like, reading comics. For lack of a better term, reading comics is kind of like, masturbating. Like, you didn't do it in public.
Right, like, nerd. What are you nerd over there reading comics? Why don't you go, where's your pocket protector at?
Right, exactly. You're like, it's like something, and like I still have that like that weird like thing about like reading comics in public, but here I was reading like this 3-issue series on a plane.
Yeah.
Like, and it's because of how it looks and how it feels, and you just want to break it out and like, truthfully, and actually, funny enough, I think because I read the book, and like in public, a guy next to me on the plane or across the aisle from me on the plane was like, is that a comic book? I'm like, yeah, it is. Like, he's like, oh, are you going to San Diego Comic-Con? I'm like, yeah, I am. Like, like it started a conversation.
Right.
And like when, truthfully, when do comics these days start a conversation that isn't about like garbage, like isn't about controversy or someone's beef with somebody else or like some internet nonsense, but like for someone to actually approach me on a plane and be like, is that a comic book? And me being like, yeah, it is. It's Batman Damned. It's like just came out like a couple months ago. I'm actually talking about the comic itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just it's necessary. I think comics need this right now.
And that kind of reminds me of something like, as someone with, as a fan, as a creator, and as someone who has a job in comics whose job is to reach the people, like when those sort of interactions happen, like what is your like sort of, how do you go about connecting with people in the public when maybe they're not even like comic book fans or regular comic book people, how do you feel like, what needs to happen, or how should people who are reading comic books like connect, start those conversations that people who maybe not are, really into it or aware of what's going on, continue those conversations?
I think that like I can only speak from my personal experience, and I've tried to like kind of like turn that into like a strategy in general. But I think the biggest thing you could do is just open the damn book in front of people. Like, like I've seen like so often a lot of what we get is just covers. You know what I mean? Like, you'll go to Newsarama or CBR, and like, yes, they give you interior art, but there's always like this barrier to entry where it's like you have to get on the site and then click some media viewer and then flip through it. And on top of that, you have to know what this book is in the first place to even want to go to the site itself. You know? And so what I've been doing, because I also handle our social media accounts for Previews World, is like I just get into the interior art and like I just start throwing the interior art of these books up on like online on Twitter, on Facebook, or Instagram. Like, sometimes I'm not even taking like the JPEGs or the PDF files. I'm like actually opening them, like, and just snapping photos of them after I've read them, like, or while I'm reading them sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a huge difference because we forget this is a visual medium. And I think in the last couple of years, I love comic book writers. Like, comic book writers are my anchor. Like, if I want to follow something, I'm like, I'm going to follow the writer, not necessarily the character.
Yeah.
But I think in the last couple of years, that's kind of like created this weird thing where like the writers have become more important than the artists. And we kind of have to remember that.
Yeah.
Comics are a visual medium. And as much as we want to poo-poo the Todd McFarlanes and Rob Liefelds of the world and like, like what the industry happened to the industry in the 90s and all this other stuff, you have to understand that the reason people were being drawn in and the reason that those sales and those numbers were so huge is because the art grabbed people's attention first.
Yes.
You know? And like and I think that's probably the biggest key there is like you just open the damn book, like, show people what you're reading. Like, like I not to wag my finger at creators, but I see so many creators on Twitter, on Instagram talking about everything else but their own comic book.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, and it's just like, it's so crazy to me because I'm like, you have this artist involved, you have this creator involved, and they do great work, but like, no one's seeing it because you're talking about 19 other things that are going on in the world, but not your own work,
Right. That's it. There's been a lot of creators that I've met over the past year and a half, through doing this podcast and going to Comic-Cons, people I've become friends with. And in that community, what I like is that they definitely talk about their own work and everybody that's involved, and those people and then those same people when they do other things outside of their own work, so there's this nice support system between each other, because like you were saying, there's these like this weird thing where the writer becomes, has become more important in some circles as the artist, and there's a stupid debate between the artist, what's more important, the artist in the writer, and like that's a stupid debate. And then you also have people that are forgotten, like the colorist and the letterer. All that stuff is so important. Like there's been so many books that I've bought just off of the art, and it turned out to be a good story also, but the art really grabbed me, and it definitely like those conversations, need to be. I feel like that's something that needs to be a part of when you're making those, when you're like making those conversations with your casual comic book fan, I think a part of it definitely still needs to be about the art, being like, look how cool this page looks right here. Look at the art. Look at the colors on this. This is like awesome. So it's really, I feel like that was really important for you to say that, like that this is a visual medium and stuff like that. So that they definitely, that needs to be a part of the conversation with both, with people who are in it and then people who are just casually in it.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%, because that's just what's going to draw people in. And if you treat the art with value, and I think that's another thing, is like the last couple of years, what we've had is, I think some of the companies have been trying to bring creators in on the cheap.
Yeah.
And so what you get is if you try to be cheap with creators, you get cheap work. You know what I mean? And so like I think a lot of times what you'll see is like art that's not very captivating, or someone who's just trying to make a deadline, or someone's like or a person who's probably a great artist on their own time, but now they have a 30-month cycle and they're just trying to crank something out. And it's just not all that interesting to look at, So, and I think there's a bunch of so there's various layers here. I think it's in terms of what you pay the artists, also just how you promote the book in general. And like, I also like kind of loathe this practice of having a different artist on the cover than the artist that's on the interiors.
Yeah.
Because I think that's also kind of like a bit of an okey doke, like, because I can think of so many times where I've picked up a book because of the cover, and it's been an artist that I knew was a great artist, like, you know what I mean? And then I open it and I'm like, oh wait, this isn't him, this isn't her.
What happened?
You know what I mean? Right, like what the hell happened? And like I have a James Stucco book, and he's got a collection of covers he's done, and like I'm looking at some of these covers and I'm like, you know what? These are great covers, and the concepts on these covers are fantastic. But I guarantee you that what like he drew for that cover doesn't actually happen in the comic book itself.
Right.
You know
Right.
what I mean? Or at the very or of course, like I just said, he's not even in the comic. Like he doesn't even draw the comic himself. You know what I mean? So I think that makes a huge difference. Like I think that like we really have to embrace the visual side of this, and like really kind of just look at the history of it, and just kind of examine like what gravitated people towards it. And I write comics.
Yeah.
I can't draw anything. Like, you know what I mean? Like I write comics. I write about comics. I am a writer. And yeah, but at the same time, I understand that this is a visual medium. So it's insane to me that like we aren't embracing that more, or embracing that correctly.
Speaking of like the visuals on comics, one thing I've liked recently that Vault Comics has been doing is been putting that small synopsis in the back of the back cover.
Of each cover, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I like that because you can look at it and just from the outside and get an idea of what the comic book is about.
Right.
And I feel like that's like just a really cool thing for people who are just out there not knowing what they want, along with like the cool like cool artwork. I feel like that little synopsis really helps from the outside.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's an idea, of course, they stole from novels, right? Like,
Right.
like, you know what I mean? Like, but I mean, there's a reason that it's there, because, novels have to do it, because novel covers aren't typically all that cool. Like, let's be honest.
No.
And like, but so you have to flip it over in the back and see what this is really about if you don't know what it is. And I think that's, again, honestly, it's a visual trick. It kind of is, even though it's using words, it's still a design choice. You know what I mean?
Right.
A visual design choice. So again, like embracing the visual aspects of it, pulling people in, like really selling them on your content.
From your position, from what your job is, and with so many comic books that are out these days and come out each week, how what's the best way for any company, whether it's these smaller companies, the bigger companies, or just DIY creators, like what's the best way to stand out?
I can only tell you. Well, I can tell you what I've noticed is that a lot of comics these days are when you look at the synopsis, like we were just talking about the synopsis on the back cover, but a lot of like we have our previews catalog that we put out every month, and those and each book has a synopsis of what it's about.
Yeah.
And so many of those books, it drives me nuts. So many of the titles I see in there are mysterious thing happens to this mysterious guy, and then he has to solve a mystery. And it's just like, I don't want to read that. I don't care about that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's that J.J. Abrams mystery box thing that kind of drives me nuts, because like, it's dangling a carrot in front of you on the hopes that you'll want to stick around to the end. And look, Stan Lee was smart for a reason. And that wasn't just Stan Lee, but he was kind of a carnival barker, and that the sensationalism that went on the cover told you everything that was at stake.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I know he didn't create this concept of the of text on the page and all that stuff, but at the same time, he was better at it than most people. And I think that that needs to come back as well. Like you need to have covers that shout at people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like art, like visually, just in terms of what the artist is doing, but also just in terms of your wording.
Right.
So, did I answer your question? Actually, I don't know. If I answered your question or not.
You totally did. Totally did.
Okay.
But it's we're in this time now where you have these huge movies about comic book heroes and whatnot, and I'm not sure if that necessarily ever equates to comic book readers like being born out of any of that. But
Right,
how
yeah.
from your standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, how do you try to at least get even like a trickle of that business from how big like an Avengers are or Black Panther or stuff like that? How do you use that success to try to get more comic book readers out there?
So the funny thing about this is that so I do a show every week called Previews World Weekly. It's on YouTube, and we basically just like a 30-minute show. We just basically talk about the world of comics that week
Yeah.
and all the things that are comic book adjacent, right? Or a handful of things are comic book adjacent. We try to keep it focused on comic book stores and not so much like comic book movies and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about this is we have a segment we do every week, called Social Swamp. And one week, it's basically we ask our viewers a question, and the viewers respond, and then we do the responses on the show. And one week we did one where we said, "How did you get into comics?" Just a very simple question. And I was surprised by how many people came in from comics from outside media.
Oh.
And that's across several generations. I had a handful of people who are saying like, I saw Spider-Man as Amazing Friends, or I saw Superman the movie, or I saw Batman 1989, or I watched the X-Men cartoon. You know what I mean? Or I saw Spider-Man in 2002. Like people so I think there is a correlation there, but it's like anything. Like there's going to be like this attrition. There's going to be this trickle down that's going to happen because of it. And so like you're not going to get $1 million, $1 billion worth of Captain Marvel viewers to pick up a Captain Marvel comic,
Right.
but you might be able to get a couple of hundred. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or a couple of thousand, or maybe a couple of thousand. You know what I mean? And so like I think that like that, and so there is a direct link, and I think that it's a healthy link. But I also think that at that point it's on the responsibility of the publishers to kind of keep them there, you know. And I think sometimes the tactics that like some of the publishers use don't always work out. Don't always make it easy, like you said, for new readers to want to stay. And that goes back to our whole vinyl comparison. You know what I mean? Like like giving them. I think that there's an importance in. I just came out of Avengers Endgame, right? And I am high on this idea of the Avengers and time travel, and like I want something just like that. You know what I mean? Can I get that at a comic shop right now?
Right.
You know what I mean? And it doesn't have to be exactly a time travel store, of course, right? But I think that like if someone was coming into a comic shop right now, I'd be like, yes, you can pick up Jason Aaron's Avengers, and you'll probably get that same kind of feeling. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that my job isn't so much to make sure that those people get funneled from the movie theater to the comic shop.
Yeah.
But to make sure that I'm maintaining their interest as the movie's coming out, so that they're curious about what else these characters are doing. Because my attitude has always been the movies are, if the movies are the adaptation, like they're the Hollywood version of the real life adventures of these characters.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's almost like the difference between reading Malcolm X and watching Malcolm X. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like Superman isn't Christopher Reeve. That's the Hollywood version of Superman. You know what I mean? But Superman, the real Superman, is in comic books, and his life story has been playing out for over 80 years.
Right.
And so you kind of have to like maintain that interest in that. Like, and I think, tapping into the history of the character, letting them know what's currently coming out, and what stories, also past and present, also kind of will give you the same kind of feel of the movie you just saw, I think is also important. One thing I think that like I would like to see more of is just reminders at to reminders before these films to go to your local comic book store.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like I think that like even if it's just like the little stills that they play before the movie, or if it's just a full blown commercial, like especially now that these like companies like Marvel and Disney are like part of the same entity. Like like I feel like that should be easier now. Like DC and Warner Bros. Have always been that part of the same entity, you know, and like to just see something that says, hey, before you watch this movie, remember this is a comic book, and remember that you could pick up the further adventures of these characters every week at your local comic book store. So I think that's something that like probably I would like to see more of, but
Right.
I don't. Is that in Diamond's hands? I don't really think so because again, we're talking about other people's IPs, but like it would be something that I would love to see the big two do for sure.
Yeah, that would be a great idea, and I think that would actually like help you. It would at least get plant a seed in some people's minds. It would because there's some people that don't even know comic books exist anymore.
Oh yeah.
So if you
Yeah.
just had that sort of reminder in the mainstream like that when you're actually at the movie, it might actually plant some seeds in their mind. And whether it's actually in a comic book store or the stuff that goes on online, what's your thoughts about like if someone's like, hey, yo, I went to the Avengers and I love this movie, I love Black Panther, or they like something as comic book related in regards to a TV show or a movie, but they were looking for something different that was along those lines. What do you feel like is the best way to get people to maybe check out some smaller companies or independent artists, that do stuff that maybe around in that sort of same vein?
That's a tricky one. Like I think that like I know I've seen solicitations and like ads from other companies that aren't the big two that are like, oh, it's like this movie and this movie together,
Yeah.
And I think that is useful. Like I even do that myself on our social media. Like I'll say something along the lines of, if you like, try to think of a good example. I can't think of any good examples right now. If you like the TV show The Magicians, right? Or if you like Now You See Me or The Magicians, then maybe you'll like Mark Miller's Magic Order from Image Comics,
Yeah.
But like, and like, that is technically a smaller title. Like, it's not a Marvel or DC release,
Right.
So like trying to find those comparisons, like, cause sometimes it's just a shot in the dark when I do it. Like, it's just sort of like, I'll read it and I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's kind of like this and it's kind of like that, you know? But I don't know if that necessarily works all the time. Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. Like I couldn't really tell you.
Right.
Like I think that like sure, I think it really just boils down to like the publishers. All publishers should really just have like a crackling synopsis that they can like an elevator pitch. Like you know what I mean? Like I think maybe that's the big thing here is like Hollywood has an elevator pitch. Maybe comic books need to also be able to really tap into that concept of the elevator pitch. Can I tell you what the story is about in 30 seconds?
Yeah, see, a lot of the creators that I meet at these Comic Cons, they have their elevator pitches, and I've talked to them a lot on these podcasts, on just at the Comic Cons about that, because I'll be like, man, you're doing this for like 3-4 days for all these hours talking to all these people, man. Like, I don't know how you guys do it, man.
Right. Yeah.
And
it's a lot.
but they all have their like elevator pitches and stuff like that. And I remember on one of my episodes when I was talking with Victor Dangerich, he said he's like when I'm talking to these people at the Comic Cons, we're trying to do two things. I'm trying to sell me and my product at that particular time, but then I'm also trying to have them come back and sell myself for the future, to where they might see me again next year and remember me and buy the next issue or next book that I have. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah, kind of talk about like the sort of like what, whether it's in your position or in the creator's position, to where, you know, they can market themselves or, you know, do that elevator pitch, how important that is.
Well, you know what? I'm across the streams a little bit here because I normally don't do, but I can talk about it as a creator.
Yeah.
And so, like, I have a comic. It's called Fight of the Century, and like, I've always kind of we came into it early on saying, okay, what are the things that we're noticing everybody's doing that we cannot do? Like, you know
Right.
what I mean? And not even necessarily that we can't afford to do it, although that does factor in as well. But also but also just like, what are things that we feel like people are getting tired of? You know what I mean? And so truthfully, look, I'm a black creator. And so truthfully, my number one thing going in was like, actually, it's funny. We created a business plan for this comic back in 2014, I want to say.
Yeah.
And our business plan included, we're going to talk about how we're black creators. We're trying to diversify the landscape. We're going to try to, like, you know, our goal is to make inclusivity important is to prioritize inclusivity, like all these things. This was 2014.
Yeah.
Right. By the time we actually got to the point that we had hired an artist, hired a colorist, hired an inker, completed the first 2 scripts, it was already like 2017, right?
Yeah.
And we were going to Kickstarter. And I looked at my co-creator and I was like, we cannot do the whole diversity inclusivity thing. Everybody's doing it. Like, we can't.
Right.
Like, it just sounds like the same thing over and over again. It just sounds like an echo chamber now. Like, everybody's doing that. And you know how I know it's getting tired? Because corporations started doing it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it was one thing when the small press guys were doing it and they were succeeding by doing that. But the minute, like, and I'm not even talking about like Marvel DC, I'm talking about Coca-Cola and, you know, like Chevy and, like, you know, like, I'm talking about corporations, like,
Right,
you know what I
right.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
started doing the inclusivity, diversity angle. And I was like, well, it's tainted now.
Yeah.
Because now it's just a talking point. Like, it's just this hollow thing that people are saying just to make money.
Yeah.
And so our attitude was like, okay, look, maybe we don't have to wear this on our sleeve. Like, I'm a black creator. Anybody who looks at me knows I'm a black creator. Anybody who looks at him knows we're black creators. Like, you know what I mean? Like, anybody who looks at our artist knows that he's Filipino. Anybody who looks at well, maybe not Filipino, but they'll know he's Asian, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, and like anybody who looks at the rest of our creative team will know that they're Brazilian. Like, you know what I mean? Like, maybe we don't have to say that outright. And on top of that, our main character is Afro-Brazilian. Like, you know, so maybe, like, we don't have to say that anymore. Like, maybe that's actual progress.
Yeah.
And so, like, the idea is there, so what else can we focus on? It's like, all right, you know what? Let's focus on the things that people might find similar to this. So we said Creed, Akira, Blade Runner. Like, you know, we just went down the list of things that were inspirations to us, and we started pitching it that way.
Okay.
And so that was the angle we took. And then once we kind of like, and I think the useful thing about that was that once we kind of like checked marked all the things that influenced this particular story, we were able to describe the tone of it.
Okay.
And then it kind of like rolled into, well, okay, it's all right. So what are some of these things have in common? Well, okay, of course, Creed is a sports movie, right? So of course we've already got that covered. And we were like, what else did we say that we like? Oh, well, we liked we were influenced by I'm blanking now, sorry. Blade Runner and Akira. Well, that's cyberpunk. All right, so we tell people it's cyberpunk and it's a sports story, you know? And then on top of that, like, well, what else is it like? It was like, oh, there's actually some Frankenstein elements in there. So why don't we just tell people it's like Frankenstein? And we're like, okay, so it's like, it's a cyberpunk sports story with elements of Frankenstein. And when you tell people that, they're like, what?
Right.
You know? And they go, and they then when you tell people that at a convention, they go, really? And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. And then they look at us and they go, 2 black guys made this cyberpunk Frankenstein story that's about MMA. And then they pick it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's like kind of important to kind of go against the grain. Because like you kind of have to know when you're just kind of, I guess it's a long way of saying you kind of have to know when you're just saying the same thing that everybody else is saying and just be aware of that, you know? And try to find different ways to introduce this concept to people. And I think in doing so, once you start pulling away from what other people are doing and start trying to find your own thing, then you get to the heart of it.
Yes.
And
Right.
people will always respond to that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the whole, thing where your original idea was to talk about, being, black creators and diversity and stuff. And what I've noticed is like, yeah, like the corporations are taking hold of it, but like by now with the corporations saying, being it's happened so much, and then what's going on in the media, in our society, government, people from creators from like marginalized communities are at this point kind of sick of doing the 101s of whatever they are, black
Right,
101,
right,
diversity 101, teaching
right.
people about who they are, when
Yeah,
at this point, yeah, maybe there has been some progress. So let's just have the work do the talking,
yeah.
and you can learn from the work. You can see that that you're a black creator, and just kind of like just sell the work as the work, and then you'll be like, oh, all right, he's a black creator, and this is, you know, and this kind of goes into the next thing, like, as a creator, and then also just whenever you're seeing these comics to market, like how important is it for there to be like authenticity with the characters and with the characters in relations to these sort of things that you were just talking about, like being black, or if it's like a gender thing or a sexuality thing or whatever that's going on. How important is like being genuine and authentic with these things that you're creating?
So one of the things we did early on was we made sure that we actually hired Brazilian creators to work with us. And I think that made a huge difference. Like, I mean, I have friends from Brazil, but at the same time, like, I don't speak Brazilian Portuguese, like, you know what I mean? And like, it was one of those things where, and like, they keep threatening to take me on a vacation to Brazil, which is like, honestly not that bad because they're going to go to the rural side. And like, I think it's interesting. I kept pushing for that early on, and my co-creator was kind of like, like, oh well, we can get this ink or we can get this because he was trying to utilize his resources, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, no, no, no. I was like, we need an inker. It's like if we already have the, it's like we already have the penciler who's Filipino, right? And like, he nails the style, so I'm not asking anybody to change that. But if we can find an inker and a colorist that fulfills that goal, fulfills that role, and maybe even like some additional people who we can pull into the creative process. So we got a translator on top of that, and we're constantly kind of going back and forth with them to kind of be like, is this accurate? Is this accurate? A matter of fact, one of the things that our inker has done is he's kind of gone back and worked out with the penciler, like, no, this area of Brazil does not look like this. It looks like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, and adding those details to it, which I think is great. And like he'll do little small things in the background, like he'll change the wording of a sign or something like that. And he's like, he always kind of asks, "Is this okay?" And I'm like, "That's fine." Like, this better. This guy who actually lives in the Amazon, which is pretty nuts.
Right.
But like, it was like, but I'm like, that's fine. Like, this better than we do. Like, we're trying to just tell a sci-fi story about people punching each other. Like, you know what I mean? But this is representing something that you live. So we are listening to you. And I think that makes a huge difference. Like, I think that like you have to invite people into the process, and I often struggled with, I remember a few years ago, there's a bit of a blow up about Greg Pak writing a Storm comic because he wasn't black or African. Right.
Right.
And I won't go that far because I think that ultimately if you have a story to tell, then you should tell your story. But I think at the same time, what it might have been useful is if you brought on a black or African artist to draw that story.
Right.
And I think that kind of makes that small difference. Like, yeah, if like, you want to make sure that you're trying to be as authentic as possible. Even like these make believe lands of like, Wakanda or like, where mutants exist and all this other stuff, like you still want to find something to ground it in. Just because you want people to be able to like reach out and grab it when they're reading your story. It needs to feel palpable in some way, shape, or form. And
Right.
it's a slippery slope. There's no right answer to it. Like, I mean, there's no simple answer to it. But to me, the simplest answer was bring in creators who understand the culture.
Yeah, definitely. It's and kind of going back to like what your like original like business plan was for your comic,
Hmm.
and kind of bringing it in today after how important is it for different types of people to see that representation in comics these days? Um, like like a young black kid seeing Miles Morales,
Hmm.
or that's a easy example,
Hmm.
but with comics being sort of like a good old boys white man club for so long, how important is it to have those genuine characters, so that like young kids can see the representation of all sorts.
Um, you know, I I can only talk about what worked for me. And I remember as a kid, like whenever like my parents gave me something to read or like watch, it was usually because of the representation factor and or like it has some educational component. And I look, we've all been like 6 or 7 or 8 years old, right? When your parents hand you something like that, you're not into it. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's just kind of how these things work. Like you're just sort of like, am I supposed to learn something from this? I don't want to look at this. I would much rather like watch something else, you know? But at the same time, I think that like, the culture has shifted, and this is something that I've had to get used to, which is that like the idea of comic book culture has shifted, or like geek culture in general has shifted, and so I think that there's an importance in telling universal stories that everybody can grasp onto. But at the same time, I do understand that there's an aspect of geek culture that really gravitates to wanting to see themselves in the character,
Yeah.
and I can't poo-poo that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, if that's what you get out of these stories, then so be it. Me personally, I just want a good story.
Right.
And that's always the angle I've taken. And is it nice to have like characters of color in these stories? Yes, because that represents the world. And that's how the world operates. Like we're in a like, the world is a mixture of cultures. One thing that I've always kind of taken issue with is this idea that comics have always been this good old boys club, actually, and not even really to correct you, but like this idea that like I think for the first couple of years, as this conversation was really starting to take hold, like in the last like 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
like the conversation was that comics have always been about white guys, and I honestly can't say that's true because I was reading X-Men, like, in the late 80s and early 90s.
Right.
Like, Storm was the leader of the team. Like, she was having two-part, like, romantic adventures with, like, Forge. Like, you know what I mean? Like the idea that, like, these things were, like, it was a mix of cultures was a real thing. Like, when I first picked up an X Factor comic, Larry Stroman was the artist,
Right.
you know? Like Luke Cage had already existed. Like I had a crush on Misty Knight in the '90s. Like, you know what I mean? Like all these different characters like came into play. Like when I found out Lucius Fox was responsible for building the Batmobile, like I was like, oh, that's awesome. Like,
Right.
so like all these different things like kind of like factored in. But I think that like we do have to progress more and more. But I guess it's a long way of saying, I can't really explain what that means to somebody else,
Right.
but I can tell you what it means to me in terms of like how it works. And to me, I feel like, you know what? Here, give me 1 second here. I know this is not good for radio,
No, it's
but
fine.
or good for audio, but I'm gonna do this real quick because I'm doing a really bad job explaining this, and I don't want the internet to come after me.
I can always edit.
No, it's all good. Let's just be real about this.
Right.
But like I was watching an interview with Cornel West the other day, and he put it absolutely perfectly. And it's the thing that I've been struggling to kind of like vocalize, but he kind of like nailed it right on the head. And it was, here it is. It's not just a matter of looking for the one individual who represents. It's about connecting that representation to fundamental transformation. The last thing we need is spectacle with no substance. And that's ultimately my perspective. It's like the last thing, like, yeah, it's nice to have like, representation of Miles Morales in the Spider-Man movie. But here's the thing. If that Spider-Man movie had sucked,
Oh yeah.
then we all would have turned our back on it. Like, like, I mean, well, actually, that's not entirely true. But like, it would have meant less to me personally. You know what I mean? Like, if that Black Panther movie had sucked,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, it would have been like, it would just been like, for me personally, I've been like, all right, well, I'm just going to, at least I have Blade. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's, that's kind of how you have to look at it. Like, I think that, like, there's representation just for the sake of checking off a box.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that, like, there's something more key to that. It's like, is it a story that's going to last? Is it a story that's going to grab hold? Like, is it this just a flash in the pan so that a corporation can say that, hey, diversity, we did it,
Yeah.
Or is this something really going to have a foothold on the culture 20 years from now? And I think personally, I think that that's where particularly Black film has always been shafted, is like these things that we hold dear to our culture was always kind of looked at as less, as like some sort of lesser form of popular culture,
Right.
in the larger mainstream conversation. And so it is nice to finally see that conversation happening in the mainstream and it being like embraced, instead of being like, well, John Shaft is just an exploitation movie, or Superfly is just an exploitation movie, or like, oh, Tyler Perry is like, look, like, or Tyler Perry's just making like, vanity schlock projects. And it's like, no. These things have value because they mean something to somebody else,
Right.
and we have to recognize that. And so like, I think that maybe that's the key thing here. I'm kind of rambling, but like at the same time, but yeah, I think that's the key thing here is like, like do these things have substance? Like, do they have lasting power? And some people will say that like, you won't know that until 20 years from now, but we exist in a world where Rotten Tomatoes calls something an instant classic. So we do know. You know what I mean? Like we do know when something is actually going to last. It's like going to actually like last from here to eternity, or at least for the next 20 years or whatever it is. So yes, transform. Like, is it a fundamental transformation? Like, is it spectacle or is it spectacle or substance?
Right. And I think that's where everybody's trying to go next with everything. Like I was saying before about just people from marginalized communities just kind of being sick of having to teach people how to act in front of them or do the 101s about themselves. Like, people just want to talk about their work and the substance that they're behind, instead of like having to go back to the beginning and teach people how to deal with trans people or gay people or black people or whatever, So I definitely like agree with that. That's probably like the next thing that's gonna that people want, creators or just people that just like art in general, whatever it is that they want substance out of it. And like you said, like, yeah, there's all those things from back in the day that people hold dear to their heart. People love Shaft or Superfly, and all those, and but yeah, they were always kind of looked down upon by the
Right.
But in people these days, they don't want to be like the best black filmmaker or the best female filmmaker or whatever. They just want to be the best filmmaker, They just want that to happen. So
I hope I'm not telling too many stories out of school here, but like I did an interview with Marguerite Bennett. And she was talking about her book Animosity and some of this other stuff that was happening in in her career. And Marguerite Bennett did DC Bombshells and and Animosity and a bunch of other titles. And when we were done with the interview, to me it was almost a compliment. she said to me, she was like, "Thank you for not asking me what it's like to be a woman in comics."
Yeah.
And it didn't occur to me that I guess subconsciously, like I knew that like I wasn't even interested in that. I just was interested in her as a creator, like you know what I mean. But like for her to say that, like to me, it was kind of like the bell was like, okay, people are tired of this. Like people want substance, and like you have to give them substance. Like, yeah, you just can't slap a label on it and say done. So
Yeah, I hear that like so often with so many different types of people, whether it's women comedians or they're always just like, "Ooh, so what's it like being a woman in comedy and or shit like that."
yeah,
And
right, exactly.
and people are just like sick. They just like, I just want to be an artist. I want to talk about my art. Can we
Yeah,
just talk
yeah,
about
yeah.
that? Like, and in some cases, I understand like there's some people that are it's coming from a good place. Like they want to be able to um to help spread the word about, black issues or
Hmm.
trans issues or gay issues or whatever that's,
Hmm.
that people might not understand, but you almost have to like put yourself in their shoes and being like, yo, these people are always talking about this stuff. Let their art
Hmm.
do the talking. Let's talk
Yeah.
about their art and know what. And usually, just like it kind of happened with us just now, it
Hmm.
goes to that conversation, but through that
Yeah.
person's art, it gets there organically instead of
Right.
you just like being given some vague question, like asking some vague question, like, "Oh, so how is it like being a black man in comics?"
You're
Like
right. Yeah.
how are you
Yeah.
supposed to answer that? And it's just like, just
Hmm.
just just talk about your work, and it will eventually get to those issues if those issues are important to the creator.
Hmm. No, 100%. And like I think that like comics have a long history of being the industry that's like the industry that like was where minorities got funneled. Like it has a long history of that. I was actually at at San Diego Comic Con. Like I was like watching a panel, and it was about diversity in the world of entertainment, really. And one of the speakers, whose name I'm blanking on right now, one of the speakers made a great point. He was like, white people weren't considered white until the 1960s. And like what he meant by that was that prior to the civil rights era, when it was politically beneficial, like the concept of white only really meant you were born in America and you were a white you were a white American as we know you, a Caucasian in America. But prior to the 1960s, like if you were Polish or Italian or any form of immigrant, right? You weren't considered American. And so, and like
Right.
the interesting thing about that was that like comics were like peppered with immigrants, like second generation and first generation. And like, and that's how the industry started. It came from, Jewish creators, it came from like, Polish creators, it came from Irish creators, and they were viewed as less than. And the industry, because of it, was viewed as less than. And like that's why today we still struggle with this stigma about comics, I think, which is that like comics, they're not novels, they're not movies, so therefore they're not good enough.
Right. Right. Right.
And it comes from where comics started. Like it comes from like the fact that comics came from immigrants and like people's attitudes towards immigrants back then. But the funny thing about that is comics were also cheap, and comics were also readily available to people. And so what happened was all those immigrants who were like viewed as less than, like they were writing stuff for their audience.
Yeah.
And that's how you get something like Superman and Shazam or Captain Marvel being like selling like millions. Like you know what I mean? Like that might be exaggeration, but like selling like like insane numbers of copies, like because they were reading those books. Like people thought that like comics were for people who were illiterate. Like and like people thought that comics were for the mentally deficient. Like that was the attitude. That was the attitude that like brought forward Frederick Wortham. Like like that gave him the ability to say comic books appeal to juvenile delinquents and create juvenile delinquency. Like comic books have always been on the ropes, and it's because they've always been viewed as less than, and a lot of that comes from the fact that you know people's views about culture and people's views about like the people that created that culture, and like we're still struggling with that today. So, I when people say that like comic books have always been an old boy. What did you say? A white boys club, right?
Yeah,
A white boys club, right?
old boy network, white boys club, whatever.
Yeah, I kind of have to look at them and be like, you're talking about Hollywood. You're not talking about comic books.
Yeah, that's more or less where I was coming from with that. Like in recent time, like the sort of, I guess, people that kind of run the show in certain places. Maybe there could be more diversity there, but yeah, I guess it's more, when it comes down to like the roots of it all. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of, it came from, like you said, very, these, places of like these people who were oppressed in this country, the immigrants and whatnot. So it did have those strong roots.
Right. And like, yeah, and like, like I said, the concept of white did not pop up until the 60s, like until it was politically beneficial. And like then anybody who was not a brown person, for lack of a better description, was white. And it was like, it became, oh, it's us against them. And that's how you get stuff like Richard Nixon. Like, So I think that's the I think that comics need to I think comic creators and comic books need to understand how much of a underdog they are and start fighting back collectively, not divided, but collectively. Like the comic book industry needs to recognize that oh, hey, we've always been fighting against the larger entertainment world, against the mainstream, and we should embrace that. And I think for the most part that spirit is still very much present in comic books. But I would like to see kind of like creators all kind of like come together to kind of understand that more.
Yeah. Kind of speaking about all that, like here, and we're in 2019. There's so much comic book content in Hollywood right now. People are always losing it about the new Marvel movies or the DC movies and stuff. There's always other stuff that's kind of coming out through Hollywood, but whether it's your job with Diamond, and we kind of touched upon this at the beginning when I was like first started like really buying stuff. Like this is so much different than music stuff where I'm like, what has to deal with this pre-order crap and what's and like how why are they always stressing that and blah blah blah? Isn't it just gonna be there when it comes out? Blah blah blah. So kind of like talk about the importance of the pre-order and the importance of comic book readers and creators alike, sort of like understanding that comics are that underdog and what can everybody do just to keep to make comic books thrive more.
Support your local comic shop. I think that's like ultimately like the end game here, and support creators. And like there clearly is a geek economy that is very much alive and well, but it doesn't always trickle down to the source material. And I think that's maybe the key thing here. One thing that I've tried to vocalize within the marketing department of my job, but is that like I think that people don't want to read now. And I think that that's a big problem, and I think it's part of a larger problem problem that's bigger than comics.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like I think that comics could probably do more of an aggressive push to get people to understand the importance of reading. And I think comics can do their part in that. And I know that like there are a lot of publishers like Vault that like are appealing to libraries, you know what I mean, and to schools. And I would like to, and like I know that Marvel has done their part in that, and so has DC. But like I think that having a push to kind of get more people to read in general is pretty important, because like ultimately it could help comic books as well. Now in terms of pre-orders, because I think that like this is a cart before the horse type of thing, right? So once people are actually into the idea of reading again,
yeah,
and, and the reason I say that is because you kind of see it all everywhere, right? Like people read a headline and just react to it like, but they won't read the article because it's too much work.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you see you'll see the bookstores are closing all over the place, and like, there's no other way to really look at it in terms of, you could say, oh, it's because of digital sales and Kindle and blah 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 and this and that, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm like, no, I think that's just kind of like a red herring. I think the issue here is that people just aren't reading right now. Like, people are just not interested in reading because everything's so readily available to them, and reading takes time. It takes thought, you know. But like in terms of pre-order, just to explain what that is, Preview's catalog comes out every month, and inside that catalog is what's coming out 2 months from now. And so the idea here is that, like, you can pre-order anything in that catalog every month, and you will receive it in 2 months. And like, I've had some people like, oh, that's like, why would I do that when I can just like, click on Amazon and blah, 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 blah. But here's the thing. Video games have been doing this for years. It's not a strange concept. And so like this idea that like video games have always pushed people to pre-order, sometimes like a year and a half in advance. And so like if people can get used to that idea with comics, which is just 2 months in advance, then I think that we might like, be able to shift that. And I think some of that has to do with the language that we use at previews. I think that like, we could streamline the language a little bit more, kind of focus it a little bit more, make it a little bit more accessible to people. And we're about to do that in a big way. We have a thing called Previews Pull Box, which is going to allow people to just pre-order from our website directly to their comic shop.
Yeah.
But the catch is currently that it has to be a participating comic shop, which we have quite a few right now that are participating. But like that'll become easier to do as time rolls forward. Yeah, I mean, that's the concept behind pre-ordering. And I think that I'll use a perfect example. I know a lot of people are upset about Walking Dead 193 in terms of, Image Comics put out didn't reveal that it was the last issue until the day it released.
Right.
And so like, but here's the thing, like, if you pre-ordered it and you were just constantly pre-ordering, or you utilizing your pull box, you would have gotten the issue anyway.
Oh yeah.
So you kind of have to look at it like that, because again, we're talking about comics just like vinyl. It's like there is a collector's mentality to it. Like, I know that like the speculator market isn't what it used to be, but there's still a collector's mentality to it. I have to have the full storyline. I want the beginning, the middle, and the end. Like, I want the special edition of this. I want this version of it. I want this. And pre-ordering ensures that. So.
Yeah, and I like that recently Vault Comics got into it, where you can pre-order from their website with participating comic book shops. Yeah. And mm-hmm. I think that's a really good idea if you could just because that was another thing that I was like confused about, and I'm like, finally someone at Vault's Midnight was just like, yo, do you just want to put a pull box? And I'm like, what do I have to do? Just tell us just tell you the stuff that, yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm like, yeah, or you could just email us this is our email address. Just email us if you want something to put on your subscription. I'm like, oh, that's it. Oh, all right. That's, yeah. I mean, it's not a hard thing or anything, but
no, it's very simple.
But I think people don't understand how simple it is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the way I see it is like, you're on Amazon, right? And you have that wish list option, right? Yeah. Where you're just kind of pocketing stuff away for future purchases, or sometimes you just leave stuff in your cart, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same idea, but ultimately, like, I know I've done this before, right? You put something in your cart. 5 months from now, you go to buy like, a headlamp or something like that.
Right.
And you're like, holy crap, there's like 5 things in my cart. And you're sort of like, crap, I guess I should buy all this now. Or maybe I should get rid of it. Well, here's the thing. Comic shops make you like accountable.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you're stowing these things away week to week, month to month, so that you can pick it up at a later date, and they will call you and tell you, hey, you missed all these things. And I mean, truthfully, like, I know that people complain about the price of comics, but at the end of the day, they're $3.99. There's a lot of things that aren't $3.99. Like, there's a lot of things that cost way more. A movie ticket costs way more.
Yeah.
Like, one movie ticket costs more.
and this is just me, like, just because I know more. I come from the music side of things, and I got to know more about the process of making comics. I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, 3.99 is not bad because I want all these people to make some money if they can,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
charging 50 cents isn't going to make nobody any money.
No, not at all. Not in this day and age. Not at all.
No, no, no.
Right.
So I'm like, I'm fine to, like, pay a few bucks for a comic, just because I know, like, and these are comics that I want to support the creator, so I know that's gonna be better to help support these guys than charging 50 cents for it.
Right. No, 100%. And like actually, again, to bring up the DC Black Label, I think these books are 5.99 each. But again, you're getting quality, and I hope that I would want that to be like a trend that all the publishers would follow eventually. Is like, people complain about, oh, this book is 3.99. I only get this much story in this comic, and on top of that, there's ads in it. Hopefully, people will start to look at the DC Black Label and take it seriously as time progresses, because what you're getting is like something that's like, okay, it's $6, but you really are getting an experience. You know, like you're really getting something that's like trying to immerse you in the story, and it's incredibly effective. And I can't say enough good things about DC Black Label after reading those 3 issues of Batman Damned. So, like I think that's hopefully that's a trend that we'll see kind of like evolve in comics and continue to grow, because I want people to get as much bang for their buck as possible, you know. But at the same time, I want creators to get paid.
Right. Just kind of winding things down. You've talked a few times about the DC Black Label, but aside from the things that you've created in the DC Black Label, is there anything else any other titles or any other imprints, or is there anything that really you're impressed with these days that you would recommend people to check out that they might not necessarily know about?
Yeah, I could literally just walk around this room and just see the random comics just kind of filtered around. I would definitely actually want to mention Ahoy Comics. They're a publisher that kind of popped up, and I want to say in the last year, they've released a book called Wrong Earth, which the best way I could describe it is, what if Adam West's Batman walked through a portal and met Ben Affleck's Batman, and was kind of like, what's your problem? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, but then Adam West gets trapped in Ben Affleck's world, and vice versa. And like, you could just imagine how much chaos that creates. It's a great book, Wrong Earth, and like, I know that it's in trade now. On top of that, I'm a huge Grant Morrison fan. He's currently doing Green Lantern, which is a character that I've always kind of had I've always had a stop and go kind of relationship with. Like, I've always thought he was a cool character. And Grant Morrison is proving to me why he is a cool character, which is awesome. Like, he's basically doing like the Green Lantern is basically a space cop.
Right.
And so what Morrison's approach is, you're going to get these little one-shot stories. They're kind of like a police procedural. Imagine Law and Order in space.
Right.
Right. But ultimately, because it's Morrison, I'm more than certain that ultimately these things will build to one big conclusion that like that ties everything together. On top of that, I would say, oh well, I gotta give a shout out to House of X, Powers of X. Jonathan Hickman just jumped back on board the X-Men line, or just jumped back at Marvel, jumped back on board with Marvel, and he's doing the X-Men books right now. And everybody was saying like, oh, it's just another reboot. It's just another reboot. No, it's not. It is. He is definitely advancing the story of the X-Men, and the idea here is that like the X-Men have created their own sovereign nation, and basically they're waiting for the rest of the world to blink. And it is pretty cool and like just off of one issue, the one issue that came out last week in Powers of X that came out this week, it is already like my new favorite thing. Like, usually I stockpile comics, right, but like this one I'm like chomping at the bit to read month to month. Outside of that, I'm also reading a book called Prison School, which is a manga.
Okay.
Prison school is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a bunch of kids, a bunch of teenage boys get busted for trying to break into the girls' shower, and they get thrown into a prison within their own school. And it's basically them trying to break out. It is not for the faint of heart. It is a very much an adult comic. It is basically super bad. A manga version of Superbad, I'll say, is probably the best way, or Porky's, depending on how old you are.
Porky's, yeah.
Right. Like any teen sex comedy that you can think of, that's what this manga is, and it's actually pretty fun. Outside of that, Guardians of the Galaxy by Donny Cates is also really cool. It's not the traditional movie team, or it's not the movie team because I guess the Guardians of the Galaxy has never been a traditional team. But it's kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different characters who are now being called the Guardians of the Galaxy because they were all present for the reading of Thanos' will, and they got ambushed by Hela, and now they're pretty much fighting for survival, and that's a pretty cool one. I think they just started a new story arc recently.
Nice.
So yeah, those are just some of the ones I read. Also, Infinity 8 is another great one. It's about a spaceship that's kind of a space cruiser that gets stranded in space, and it's basically about all the different passengers. It's out from a magnetic collection. It's a French comic that they're adapting into English, and it's a lot of fun as well.
Oh, awesome. Nice.
Yeah.
And I always like to end my interviews for this podcast with the same question. And that question is, who is somebody that I could realistically interview for this podcast that would have some great stories or lessons to talk about? It can be one person or multiple people.
Oh man, okay. Multiple people, yeah. I would say you might want to talk to Maia Crown. She's from Detroit, actually.
Okay.
So she's in your backyard. Maia runs a show called MechaCon.
Yeah.
She's basically, it's her convention that she runs every year. She also does film festivals and other stuff. She is very much about supporting Black creators. So I would definitely talk to her. Outside of that, actually, know who I want to hear talk? I want to hear Greg Elise talk, because I'm curious what he'll say in a podcast. Greg Elise has a book that's out right now, and he's been making the rounds on the small press side. He picked up, I think, a couple of awards at the I think he picked up a Glyph last year. He might be somebody else you want to talk to. And I'll give a shout out to my co-creator, Fight of the Century, Nick Allen, because I'm sure he'll be like, "What about me? I know you mentioned everybody else, but not me." Yeah, you definitely want to talk to Nick Allen because he's got a lot of ideas, and he's really happy to share them with you. So.
Cool, man. It's been great talking with you, man. So much, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't even really know about in regards to the history of comics and kind of like the inner workings of it. So, yeah, thanks for all the information. And before we get out of here, where can people go online to either follow you or get more information about previews or Diamond, plug some things?
I would definitely say follow us on follow Previews World on YouTube. I do pretty much produce all the video content on that channel, and I host a weekly show every week called Previews World Weekly. We just dropped a new episode today where we talked about whether or not classic characters should change for the times, and we had some feedback from our viewers on that. So yeah, it's a 30-minute show. It just basically gets you ready for New Comic Book Day every Wednesday. It gets you excited for all the stuff that's coming out and all the stuff you should keep an eye out. And we give suggestions. And I'll give my Instagram a shout out. Just follow me at TJA Comics. I pretty much post images of just cool things I see in my travels, and I just promote my comic and everybody else's comic. Anything that I think is interesting to read. I put out there onto my Instagram. The account's locked, but I will accept your invite.
So that was my interview with Troy Jeffrey Allen. For more information about what he's doing, you can always go to freshasthepodcast.com, and there'll be links in the show notes for this episode. Before we get out of here, I want to remind you how you can support Fresh as the Word. I am on Patreon now at patreon.com/freshastheword. And for as little as $1 a month, you can support Fresh as the Word and all the other podcasts that I'll be doing coming up, including Renaissance Soul and Breaking Records. And for the $3 a month tier, you have access to the Patreon-only exclusive episodes that will have audio from my archives from interviews that I've done for the past decade or so outside of the podcasts. A lot of good stuff there. So go to patreon.com/freshastheword. You can also support via PayPal at paypal.me/freshastheword. Any dollar counts. Please support. And also, I have a bit of a wish list I'm looking for. You know, my budget for a lot of things these days is a little low. So if there's any way I could, people could trade services with me or donate some certain items, please hit me up. I do need some male to female XLR cables, some XLR splitters, some good voice recording mics, and a tall camera tripod to use with my Canon Rebel. So if you have anything, please hit me up at djkfresh@gmail.com, and we can try to work something out. And please remember to rate and review Fresh as the Word anywhere where you listen to the podcast. It always helps out, especially on Apple Podcasts. And be on the lookout for the 2 new podcasts that I'll be doing. The Detroit music podcast, Renaissance Soul, and the all-around music podcast, Breaking Records, coming on later on this month. There'll be more information about that at freshasthepodcast.com, to where you can stream, where you can follow, and everything. I'm going to try to put up some trailers for both of those ASAP. Just waiting for a few things to get it, to finish up in regards to that. But a whole lot of stuff in the books right now. So thank you for listening to this podcast and anything in the future. All right. Goodbye and good night.
Fresh is the word.